In the beginning, there was only mist and memory drifting across the Italian peninsula like the breath of sleeping gods. Long before eagles would cast their shadows over 3 continents, before the thunder of legions would echo from Britain to Babylon, there existed only the gentle murmur of the Tiber, winding its ancient path through hills that dreamed of empire. The 7 hills of Rome slumbered beneath Mediterranean skies, each one a sleeping giant, cradling secrets that would one day reshape the world. The Palatine, where shepherds once tended their flocks, would become the golden heart of imperial power. The Capitoline, crowned with sacred groves, would witness the rise and fall of gods and men. The Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, each hill a chapter in a story not yet written, each slope a stage upon which the greatest drama of human civilization would unfold. Here, in this landscape of pastoral tranquility, the first Romans were not yet Romans at all. They were Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, tribal peoples who understood the rhythm of seasons, the language of omens, the delicate balance between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. They built their humble settlements along the river's edge, never suspecting that their descendants would one day claim dominion over the known world. But already, in those early days, something stirred in the Italian soil. A restless energy that would not be contained by tribal boundaries or pastoral contentment. The land itself seemed to whisper of greater destinies, of walls that would rise to encompass not just 7 hills, but 7 seas. The legend speaks of twins, abandoned to the mercy of waters and wild beasts, suckled by a she-wolf whose fierce maternal instinct would become the template for Roman character. Romulus and Remus, names that echo through eternity, represent something far more profound than mere historical figures. They embody the essential duality of the Roman spirit, the tension between civilization and savagery, between order and violence, between the impulse to build and the instinct to destroy. When Romulus traced the sacred boundary of his city with a bronze plough, he was not merely marking territory. He was creating a new form of human community, a revolutionary concept that would challenge the very foundations of how people organized themselves. The Pomerium, that sacred boundary, separated not just inside from outside, but the civilized from the wild, the lawful from the chaotic, the Roman from the barbarian. Yet even in this moment of creation, violence intruded. The death of Remus, whether by his brother's hand or by the sword of another, stained the very foundation stones of Rome with blood. It was a prophetic moment, for Rome would be built upon such contradictions throughout its long history, creating law through violence, establishing peace through war, spreading civilization through conquest. The first Romans understood that they were participants in something larger than themselves. They saw their city not as a random collection of huts and walls, but as a sacred space where mortals and immortals might commune, where the will of the gods could be discerned through the flight of birds and the examination of sacrificial entrails. Every decision, from the mundane to the momentous, was filtered through this cosmic consciousness. The hills themselves became temples, each one dedicated to particular deities who would guide and protect the growing community. Jupiter, king of gods, claimed the Capitoline as his throne. Mars, god of war and agriculture, blessed the Campus Martius, where young Romans would learn the arts of both peace and conflict. The Palatine, where Romulus had established his royal residence, became the dwelling place of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, whose eternal flame would burn for over 1,000 years. As the sun set over these 7 hills in those earliest days, casting long shadows across the pastoral landscape, the first Romans could not have imagined the monuments that would one day crown their heights. They could not have envisioned the Colosseum rising from the valley floor, or the Forum Romanum becoming the beating heart of a world empire. They could not have conceived of aqueducts that would carry mountain water across impossible distances, or roads that would bind together peoples separated by vast expanses of sea and land. But perhaps, in the deepest recesses of their souls, They sensed the magnitude of what was beginning. Perhaps they felt the weight of destiny pressing upon their shoulders as they kindled their evening fires and told their children stories of gods and heroes. Perhaps they understood that their humble settlement was not an end, but a beginning. The first chapter in a tale that would span centuries and transform the very meaning of human possibility. The mist continued to drift across the 7 hills, carrying with it the dreams of generations yet unborn. And in that mist, if one listened carefully, one might have heard the distant sound of marching feet, the whisper of future glories, the echo of an empire that would rise like the sun itself, illuminating the ancient world with the light of Roman law, Roman roads, Roman peace. The awakening had begun, gentle and inevitable as the dawn that breaks over the eternal city, transforming night into day, dream into reality, possibility into the greatest story ever told. The expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus in 509 BCE marked not merely the end of a dynasty, but the birth of a revolutionary conception of human governance. The Roman Republic emerged from the ashes of monarchy like a phoenix, carrying within its wings the most audacious political experiment the ancient world had ever witnessed. The radical notion that power belonged not to any single individual, but to the people themselves, exercised through their chosen representatives. The story of Lucretia's rape and suicide became the founding myth of republican virtue, demonstrating that honor and liberty were worth more than life itself. Her death cry, "Never shall Lucretia provide a precedent for unchaste women to escape what they deserve," echoed through the centuries as the eternal Roman principle that personal virtue was the foundation of political freedom. Brutus, her avenger, became the archetypal Roman hero, showing that even the bonds of family must yield to the demands of justice and the welfare of the state. The establishment of the consulship represented a profound philosophical breakthrough. 2 consuls, elected annually, sharing power equally, each possessing the authority to veto the other's decisions. This system embodied the Roman understanding that absolute power was inherently corrupting, that freedom required not just good intentions, but institutional safeguards against the accumulation of authority in any single pair of hands. The consul's imperium, that almost mystical authority to command armies and execute laws, was hedged about with limitations that reflected hard-won wisdom about human nature. The consulship was annual, preventing the entrenchment of power. It was shared, preventing autocracy. It was accountable, requiring the consul to answer for his actions once his term expired. These were not mere administrative details, but the architectural principles of a new form of civilization. The early republic faced its first existential test when the exiled Tarquinius Superbus allied with the Etruscan king Lars Porsena in an attempt to restore the monarchy. The siege of Rome and the heroic defense of the bridge by Horatius Cocles became the defining moment of republican identity. Horatius, standing alone against an army, embodied the Roman principle that a single citizen, animated by virtue and courage, could hold back the forces of tyranny. The oath sworn by the first generation of republicans, "Never again shall there be a king in Rome," was not merely a political statement, but a sacred vow that would shape Roman consciousness for 5 centuries. This commitment to republican government was tested repeatedly by ambitious individuals who sought to concentrate power in their own hands. But the Roman people's devotion to their revolutionary form of government proved stronger than any individual's lust for dominance. The early republic's most profound achievement was the development of Roman law, beginning with the 12 tables around 450 BCE. These bronze tablets, posted in the forum where every citizen could read them, established the revolutionary principle that law was not the secret knowledge of priests and nobles, but the common heritage of all Romans. The phrase dura lex, sed lex, "the law is hard, but it is the law," became the foundation of Roman jurisprudence and the basis for legal systems throughout the Western world. The conflict between patricians and plebeians, known as the struggle of the orders, revealed the Republic's capacity for peaceful evolution and social progress. The plebeians' withdrawal to the Sacred Mount and their threat to establish a separate city demonstrated that Roman freedom was not the exclusive possession of the aristocracy, but the birthright of all citizens. The creation of the tribunes of the plebs, with their power to veto any action harmful to the common people, established the principle that political power must be balanced and that the voices of ordinary citizens must be heard in the councils of government. The expansion of Roman territory during the early Republic was not merely military conquest, but the systematic extension of Roman law and Roman citizenship to Italian peoples who had previously known only tribal organization and local loyalties. The Latin League, Rome's alliance with neighboring cities, established the template for Roman imperial expansion: conquest followed by integration, military victory followed by the offer of citizenship and the protection of Roman law. The Roman military system evolved in parallel with political institutions, creating the citizen-soldier ideal that would distinguish Roman civilization from every other ancient society. The Roman legionnaire was not a professional warrior serving a king, but a citizen farmer defending his own community and his own freedom. This connection between military service and political participation created a unique form of civic virtue that combined personal courage with public responsibility. The Roman concept of virtues encompassed not just military bravery, but the entire range of qualities that made a man worthy of citizenship: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. These virtues were not abstract philosophical concepts, but practical requirements for participation in public life. While the Roman citizen was expected to be a soldier when war demanded, a farmer when peace allowed, a judge when justice required, and a father when family called. The religious traditions of the Republic reflected this integration of public and private virtue. The Roman gods were not distant cosmic forces, but partners in the Roman enterprise. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, whose temple crowned the Capitoline Hill, was not merely the king of gods, but the protector of the Roman state. The elaborate rituals of Roman religion, from the taking of auspices before important decisions to the celebration of triumph after military victories, demonstrated the Roman belief that divine favor was earned through virtuous action and faithful service to the community. The Forum Romanum, the heart of Republican Rome, became the stage upon which the drama of popular government was performed daily. Here, citizens gathered to hear the debates of senators, to witness the trials of criminals, to participate in the elections that chose their leaders. The Forum was not merely a marketplace or a government center, but a sacred space where the Roman people exercised their sovereignty and demonstrated their commitment to the principles of justice and freedom. The early Republic's greatest achievement was the creation of a political culture that valued merit over birth, service over privilege, and the common good over individual advantage. The cursus honorum, the ladder of offices through which ambitious Romans climbed to positions of authority, ensured that leadership was earned through demonstrated competence and commitment to republican values. Across the wine-dark Mediterranean, beyond the horizon where Roman ships had barely dared to venture, lay a civilization that would challenge every assumption about Rome's destiny. Carthage, the daughter of Phoenician Tyre, had built her empire upon the restless waters, while Rome was still learning to govern the Seven Hills. These two powers, separated by the narrow sea that had become the arena of their rivalry, embodied fundamentally different visions of human organization. Rome, the terrestrial republic of citizen soldiers, and Carthage, the maritime empire of merchant princes. The First Punic War erupted not from grand imperial ambitions, but from the small spark of Sicilian politics. Yet this conflict would transform Rome from a peninsular power into a Mediterranean empire, forcing the Romans to master the alien element of the sea and to confront the reality that their republican ideals might need to bend before the demands of imperial expansion. The Romans' first encounter with Carthaginian sea power revealed the magnitude of their disadvantage. The Carthaginians had ruled the waves for centuries, their ships carrying precious cargoes from the Pillars of Hercules to the markets of the East. Their admirals commanded fleets with the easy confidence of those born to the sea, while Roman senators could barely comprehend the logistics of naval warfare. But the Roman response to this challenge demonstrated the essential quality that would carry them to world dominion: the ability to learn from defeat and to transform weakness into strength. The Romans studied captured Carthaginian ships, reverse-engineered their designs, and within months had constructed a fleet that could challenge Carthaginian supremacy. More importantly, they revolutionized naval warfare by inventing the corvus, the boarding bridge that allowed Roman legionaries to fight at sea as they fought on land. The victory at Mylae in 260 BCE marked Rome's transformation from a land power into a maritime empire. The bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships, displayed in the Forum, became symbols of Roman adaptability and determination. The Romans had proven that no element, no matter how alien, could resist the application of Roman ingenuity and Roman will. Yet even as Rome celebrated its naval victories, the seeds of future conflict were being sown in the bitter heart of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had witnessed his city's humiliation. The peace treaty that ended the First Punic War was, in Hamilcar's eyes, merely a truce, a breathing space in which to prepare for the inevitable resumption of hostilities. The oath he extracted from his 9-year-old son Hannibal to be an eternal enemy of Rome became the thread from which the fate of two civilizations would be woven. Hannibal Barca grew to manhood in Spain, where his father had built a new Carthaginian empire from the silver mines of the south and the fierce tribes of the interior. Here, far from the merchant palaces of Carthage, Hannibal learned the arts of war and statecraft, but more importantly, he conceived the audacious plan that would bring the Roman Republic to the brink of destruction. The crossing of the Alps in 218 BCE ranks among the most extraordinary military achievements in human history. Hannibal's army, Carthaginians, Spaniards, Numidians, Gauls, and war elephants, traversed mountain passes that had never known the footsteps of organized armies. The Alps, those barriers that had protected Italy from northern invasion since time immemorial, became the highway for Carthaginian vengeance. The psychological impact of Hannibal's arrival in the Po Valley cannot be overstated. For the first time since the Gallic sack of Rome nearly 2 centuries earlier, a foreign army stood upon Italian soil, threatening the very existence of the Roman Republic. The Celtic tribes of northern Italy, long resentful of Roman expansion, flocked to Hannibal's banners, seeing in the Carthaginian general their liberator from Roman oppression. The Battle of Trebia demonstrated Hannibal's tactical genius and Rome's dangerous overconfidence. The Roman consul Sempronius, eager for glory, led his legions into a carefully prepared trap. The Carthaginian victory was total, but more disturbing than the military defeat was the revelation that Roman invincibility was a myth. The Republic's allies throughout Italy began to waver, wondering whether their loyalty to Rome was worth the cost of Hannibal's inevitable vengeance. Lake Trasimene witnessed an even more devastating demonstration of Hannibal's superiority. The Roman army, marching through the morning mist along the lakeshore, walked into an ambush that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Consul Flaminius and 15,000 Romans died in the waters of the lake, their bodies food for fish and their spirits testimony to the price of underestimating Carthaginian cunning. But it was at Cannae that Hannibal achieved his masterpiece, a battle that would be studied by military theorists for 2 millennia as the perfect example of tactical annihilation. The Roman army, nearly 90,000 strong, represented the greatest military force the Republic had ever assembled. Consul Varro, confident in Roman numerical superiority, sought the decisive battle that would end the war at a single stroke. Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae became the template for tactical perfection. The Carthaginian center, composed of Spanish and Gauls, Aequian troops gradually gave way before the Roman assault, drawing the legions deeper into the trap. Then, like the jaws of some monstrous beast, Hannibal's African veterans struck from both flanks, encircling the Roman army and methodically destroying it. The carnage at Cannae was unprecedented in Roman experience. Consul Paulus died fighting beside his men, along with 80 Roman senators and nearly 50,000 soldiers. The Roman military system, seemingly invincible since the days of Romulus, lay in ruins on the plains of Apulia. For the first time in their history, Romans faced the real possibility that their city might fall, their republic might perish, their way of life might vanish from the earth. The aftermath of Cannae revealed the true character of Roman civilization. Lesser peoples might have sued for peace, might have accepted vassalage, might have retreated behind their walls to await the inevitable siege. But the Roman Senate, meeting in emergency session, refused even to negotiate with Hannibal. The Republic would fight on, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter the consequences. The Roman response to Cannae demonstrated the institutional strength that would carry them through 2 more years of desperate warfare. Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator in Rome's darkest hour, understood that direct confrontation with Hannibal was suicide. His strategy of delay and harassment, of avoiding pitched battle while slowly weakening Carthaginian strength, earned him the contemptuous nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Yet this strategy of patient endurance proved to be Rome's salvation. The war in Italy became a contest of wills rather than a clash of armies. Hannibal could win battles, but he could not win the war. The Roman alliance system, built upon shared interests and mutual respect rather than mere fear, proved remarkably resilient. Most of Rome's allies remained loyal, even in the Republic's darkest hour, demonstrating that Roman imperialism offered something that Carthaginian liberation could not match: the prospect of partnership in a greater enterprise. The emergence of Scipio Africanus marked the turning point in Roman fortunes. Young, brilliant, and unconstrained by the military orthodoxies that had led to disaster at Cannae, Scipio understood that Rome could not defeat Hannibal in Italy. Instead, he proposed the audacious strategy of carrying the war to Africa, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general to defend the homeland. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE was the culmination of the greatest war the ancient world had ever seen. Scipio, now the equal of Hannibal in tactical skill and superior in strategic vision, turned the Carthaginians' own methods against him. The Roman cavalry, long inferior to Carthaginian horse, had been trained to Numidian standards. The Roman infantry, tempered by years of warfare, had learned to match Carthaginian flexibility with Roman discipline. The meeting between Scipio and Hannibal before the battle represented one of history's great encounters. 2 generals who had shaped the destiny of nations facing each other across the narrow space that separated their armies. Their conversation, preserved by ancient historians, revealed the tragic grandeur of their conflict. Both men understood that this battle would determine not just the fate of their respective cities, but the future direction of Mediterranean civilization. Hannibal's defeat at Zama was not merely a military reverse, but the end of an era. The Carthaginian Empire, built upon commercial supremacy and naval power, could not survive the loss of its greatest general and finest army. The peace treaty that followed reduced Carthage to a shadow of its former self, stripped of its empire, its fleet, and its independence. The Punic Wars transformed Rome from a regional power into the master of the Mediterranean. The Republic had proven that its institutions could survive the greatest test, that its citizens could endure the most severe trials, that its vision of human organization was superior to any alternative. Yet victory came at a cost that would haunt Roman consciousness for generations: the realization that survival might require the abandonment of the very principles that had made survival worthwhile. The smoke of Carthaginian pyres drifted across the Mediterranean, carrying with it the dreams of a civilization that had dared to challenge Rome's destiny. In that smoke, Romans glimpsed both their greatest triumph and their deepest tragedy, the understanding that empire, once gained, could never be relinquished, that the price of dominion was eternal vigilance, eternal warfare, eternal expansion. The Mediterranean had become a Roman lake, but the Romans had become something they had never intended to be: the masters of the world, with all the burdens and temptations that such mastery entailed. The destruction of Carthage left Rome standing alone beneath Mediterranean skies, no longer fighting for survival but grappling with the intoxicating burden of uncontested supremacy. The Roman eagles, once symbols of a republic's determination to remain free, now cast their shadows across 3 continents, carrying with them a civilization that would reshape the fundamental assumptions of human existence. The conquest of Greece presented Rome with its most profound cultural challenge. Here was a civilization that had achieved intellectual and artistic heights that Romans could barely comprehend, yet had proven incapable of organizing itself for effective resistance. The Greek cities, torn apart by their eternal feuds and philosophical disputes, fell to Roman legions with an ease that surprised even the conquerors themselves. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE marked the end of Macedonian independence and the beginning of Rome's transformation from a practical republic into the heir of Alexander's cultural legacy. Perseus, the last Macedonian king, was paraded through Rome's streets as a living symbol of Greek defeat, but the true victory belonged to Greek civilization itself. The Romans, who had conquered Greece with their swords, would themselves be conquered by Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek poetry, and Greek learning. The cultural synthesis that followed the Greek conquest created a new form of civilization, neither purely Roman nor purely Greek, but something unprecedented in human history. Roman pragmatism merged with Greek intellectual sophistication to produce a hybrid culture that combined the best of both traditions. The Roman elite began to speak Greek as fluently as Latin, to study philosophy in Athens, to collect Greek art, and to employ Greek tutors for their children. Yet this cultural transformation was not without its critics. Cato the Elder, the embodiment of traditional Roman values, warned that Greek influence was corrupting Roman virtue and undermining the martial spirit that had made Rome great. His famous cry, "Carthage must be destroyed," was matched by an equally passionate denunciation of Greek luxury and Greek decadence. The tension between Roman tradition and Greek innovation would remain a defining characteristic of Roman civilization for centuries to come. The Spanish campaigns revealed another aspect of Roman expansion, the systematic incorporation of diverse peoples into a unified imperial system. The Iberian Peninsula, with its fierce tribes and rich mineral resources, became a laboratory for Roman colonial administration. Here, Romans learned to govern peoples whose languages, customs, and traditions were utterly foreign to their own experience. The siege of Numantia, lasting 14 years, demonstrated both Roman persistence and the price of resistance to Roman expansion. The city that had held out longer than Carthage itself finally fell not to Roman valor, but to Roman engineering and Roman patience. The systematic starvation of Numantia became a template for Roman siege warfare, showing that Rome would spend whatever resources were necessary to achieve its objectives. The Roman road system, begun during the conquest of Italy, expanded across the Mediterranean world like the arteries of some vast organism. The Via Egnatia connected Rome to Byzantium. The Via Domitia linked Italy to Spain. The Via Appia stretched from Rome to Brundisium. These roads were not merely military highways, but the physical manifestation of Roman imperial unity. Along these stone pathways traveled not just Roman legions, but Roman law, Roman trade, Roman ideas, and Roman citizens. The construction of Roman roads required engineering skills that surpassed anything previously attempted in human history. Roman engineers ed to bridge rivers, tunnel through mountains, and span valleys with stone arches that would endure for millennia. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," became more than a metaphor. It was a literal description of a transportation network that connected every corner of the Mediterranean world to the eternal city. The Roman military evolved in response to the challenges of governing a world empire. The citizen-soldier ideal of the early republic gave way to the professional legions of the imperial period. Men like Marius reformed the Roman army, creating a military machine that could campaign for years at a time in distant lands, supported by a sophisticated logistics system that could supply armies thousands of miles from Rome. The Roman legion became the most effective military organization the ancient world had ever seen. Its combination of discipline, flexibility, and technological superiority made it virtually invincible in pitched battle. The legionnaires' equipment, the gladius, the pilum, the scutum, and the lorica, was standardized throughout the empire, creating a uniformity that reflected Rome's broader cultural mission. The conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar demonstrated the full maturity of Roman military and political organization. Caesar's campaigns were not merely military adventures, but systematic exercises in imperial expansion. His famous commentaries on the Gallic Wars revealed the Roman method in all its complexity: the careful intelligence gathering, the diplomatic manipulation of tribal rivalries, the strategic use of terror and mercy, the methodical transformation of conquered territories into Roman provinces. The Gallic Wars also revealed the growing tension between republican institutions and imperial responsibilities. Caesar's decade-long command in Gaul violated traditional Roman limitations on military authority, but the magnitude of his achievements made such violations seem necessary. The wealth that flowed from Gallic conquest into Roman coffers financed, too, the transformation of Rome from a city-state into a world capital. The cultural impact of Roman expansion was as significant as its military and political consequences. The peoples conquered by Rome were not merely subjected to Roman rule, but were invited to participate in Roman civilization. The Latin language spread throughout the Mediterranean world, becoming the common tongue of educated discourse. Roman law provided a framework for justice that transcended local customs and tribal traditions. The Roman concept of citizenship underwent a gradual but revolutionary transformation during this period of expansion. What had once been the exclusive privilege of those born on the Seven Hills became a status that could be earned through military service, purchased with wealth, or granted as a reward for loyalty. The extension of Roman citizenship to non-Romans created a new form of human community, one based not on ethnicity or geography, but on shared allegiance to Roman law and Roman values. The architectural transformation of Rome itself reflected the city's new role as capital of the world. The spoils of conquest funded magnificent building projects that transformed the modest city of the early Republic into the most splendid metropolis the world had ever seen. The Theatre of Marcellus, the Campus Martius, the Circus Maximus, these monuments proclaimed Rome's cultural supremacy as clearly as military victories proclaimed its political dominance. The Roman elite, enriched by the spoils of empire, began to live on a scale that would have shocked their ancestors. The simple lifestyle of the early republic gave way to luxurious mansions filled with Greek art, exotic foods, and entertainment that rivaled anything in the Hellenistic kingdoms. This transformation of Roman society created new tensions between traditional values and imperial realities. The slave system that sustained Roman prosperity revealed the moral contradictions inherent in imperial expansion. The conquest of new territories provided a constant supply of captives who were sold into slavery throughout the Roman world. The great slave plantations of Sicily and southern Italy, worked by prisoners of war from distant lands, became the economic foundation of Roman wealth and leisure. Yet even as Rome expanded its territorial dominion, it faced the challenge of maintaining its republican institutions. The governance of distant provinces required administrative skills and resources that strained the traditional system of annual magistrates and citizen assemblies. The growth of professional armies loyal to individual commanders rather than to the state created new possibilities for political violence and civil war. The expansion of Roman power during this period established patterns that would define Mediterranean civilization for centuries to come. The Roman peace, enforced by Roman arms, created conditions for trade, cultural exchange, and technological innovation on an unprecedented scale. The Roman legal system provided a framework for justice that would influence legal traditions throughout the Western world. As the sun set over the expanding empire, its light reflected off Roman standards planted in British soil, Spanish silver mines, Greek temples, and Egyptian pyramids. The eagles that had once protected 7 hills now claimed dominion over 7 seas, and the Romans who had once feared Carthaginian ships now commanded fleets that patrolled from Gibraltar to the Black Sea. Yet in this moment of unprecedented triumph, perceptive observers might have detected the first shadows of future troubles. The very success of Roman expansion had created problems that republican institutions were ill-equipped to solve. The wealth of empire bred corruption, and the command of distant armies encouraged ambition, and the integration of diverse peoples challenged traditional notions of Roman identity. The Mediterranean world had become Roman, but in conquering the world, Rome had begun the slow process of conquering itself. The eagles flew higher than ever before, but the winds that bore them aloft carried within them the seeds of transformation that would ultimately reshape both the empire and the emperors who would come to rule it. The very success of Roman expansion sowed the seeds of the Republic's destruction, for empire and republican government proved to be incompatible bedfellows. The wealth that flowed into Rome from conquered territories created opportunities for corruption on a scale that the founders of the Republic could never have imagined, while the command of distant armies gave ambitious generals resources that dwarfed the traditional limitations of republican office. Gaius Marius emerged from this changing world as the first Roman to understand that the old rules no longer applied. A new man from the Latin countryside, Marius lacked the aristocratic pedigree that had traditionally opened the path to high office, but he possessed something more valuable in the new age: the ability to win battles and the willingness to reward his soldiers with land and booty. His military reforms transformed the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force, but they also created a dangerous new dynamic in Roman politics. The Marian legions were no longer farmers defending their own fields, but professional soldiers whose loyalty belonged to the general who paid them rather than to the state that had recruited them. This fundamental shift in military allegiance would poison Roman politics for the next century, as ambitious commanders used their armies as political weapons in the struggle for personal dominance. The social war erupted when Rome's Italian allies, who had borne the burdens of imperial expansion without sharing its benefits, finally demanded the citizenship that had been repeatedly promised but never delivered. The irony was bitter. Rome, which had shown such generosity in extending citizenship to distant Gauls and Spaniards, proved reluctant to grant the same privilege to the Italian peoples who had been its most faithful allies. The war revealed the contradictions inherent in Roman imperial expansion. Rome's strength had always rested upon its ability to integrate conquered peoples into its political system, but the very success of this policy had created a citizen body too large and diverse to be governed by the traditional institutions of a city-state. The Forum could no longer accommodate the assemblies of citizens, and the offices of the Republic could no longer manage the administrative complexity of a world empire. Sulla's response to the social war demonstrated the extent to which republican institutions had been corrupted by imperial success. His march on Rome with a professional army, the first time in Roman history that a Roman general had used military force against his own city, shattered the constitutional taboos that had protected the Republic for 4 centuries. The precedent was set. When politics failed, Romans would resolve their disputes with swords. The proscription lists that Sulla posted in the Forum marked a new low in Roman political discourse. The systematic murder of political opponents, the confiscation of their property, and the exile of their families transformed political competition into a life-or-death struggle. The heads of senators and equities displayed on the rostra became symbols of the Republic's moral collapse, visual evidence that Roman virtue had been sacrificed on the altar of personal ambition. Yet even Sulla's dictatorship demonstrated the enduring power of republican ideology. After reforming the constitution to strengthen aristocratic control and weaken popular assemblies, Sulla voluntarily resigned his extraordinary powers and retired to private life. His action proved that even the most successful Roman strongman still felt compelled to pay homage to republican traditions, even as he violated them. The rise of Pompey the Great embodied the new realities of Roman politics. His extraordinary commands in the East, his triumph over the pirates, his conquest of Jerusalem, these achievements made him the most famous Roman of his generation, but they also made him a threat to the traditional balance of republican government. Pompey's wealth and prestige dwarfed those of any senator, while his veterans provided him with a private army that could dominate any political assembly. The first triumvirate represented the Republic's transformation into an oligarchy of strongmen. Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus divided the Roman world among themselves like Hellenistic kings, using their combined resources to manipulate elections, intimidate opponents, and circumvent constitutional limitations. The secret alliance demonstrated that republican institutions had become mere facades, concealing the reality of personal rule by military commanders. Caesar's Gallic campaigns were simultaneously the Republic's greatest military achievement and its most dangerous constitutional violation. His conquest of Gaul extended Roman power to the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel, bringing immense wealth and glory to Rome, but his decade-long command violated every republican principle regarding the limitation of military authority. Caesar's army became personally loyal to him rather than to the state, creating the military foundation for his eventual dictatorship. The wealth that Caesar extracted from Gaul transformed Roman politics by providing him with resources that exceeded those of the state itself. His ability to bribe voters, finance public works, and reward supporters gave him advantages that no republican politician could match through legitimate means. The Gallic gold that filled Caesar's treasury became the currency of the Republic's corruption. Crassus's expedition against Parthia Rev healed the limits of Roman military invincibility and the dangers of unchecked ambition. The richest man in Rome, desperate to match the military achievements of his partners in the triumvirate, led 7 legions into the Mesopotamian desert, where they were destroyed by Parthian horse archers at the Battle of Carrhae. Crassus's death, his mouth reportedly filled with molten gold by his captors, became a symbol of the price of avarice and the dangers of imperial overreach. The collapse of the triumvirate after Crassus's death left Caesar and Pompey as rivals for supreme power, but the Roman constitution provided no mechanism for resolving such a conflict peacefully. The Senate's decision to recall Caesar from Gaul without granting him the consulship he sought created an impossible choice. Caesar could return to Rome as a private citizen and face prosecution by his enemies, or he could retain his command illegally and become a public enemy. The crossing of the Rubicon on January 10, 49 BCE became one of history's most famous points of no return. Caesar's decision to lead his army across the tiny stream that marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy was simultaneously a violation of Roman law and an assertion of personal authority over constitutional limitations. His alleged words, "The die is cast," captured the finality of his choice and the inevitability of the civil war that would follow. The civil war that consumed the Republic for the next 4 years revealed the extent to which Roman political culture had been militarized. Senators fled Rome as Caesar's legions approached, the Forum was abandoned for army camps, and political issues were resolved through pitched battles rather than debate and compromise. The Republic's death throes played out on battlefields from Spain to Egypt, as Roman armies fought Roman armies in a conflict that knew no victors, only survivors. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE marked the effective end of the Roman Republic, though few contemporaries recognized it at the time. Pompey's defeat and flight to Egypt, where he was murdered by Egyptian courtiers seeking Caesar's favor, eliminated the last credible challenge to Caesar's supremacy. The Republic's champion died ignominiously on a foreign shore, his severed head presented as a gift to the man who had destroyed the constitution they had both sworn to uphold. Caesar's dictatorship represented the Republic's transformation into a monarchy in all but name. His accumulation of unprecedented powers, Dictator Perpetuo, Pontifex Maximus, Imperator, created a new form of Roman government that retained republican terminology while concentrating all authority in a single individual. The Senate continued to meet, the assemblies continued to vote, but real power resided with Caesar alone. The conspiracy that ended Caesar's life on the Ides of March 44 BCE was motivated by a desperate desire to restore republican government, but it achieved only the opposite. The assassination of Caesar in the Senate House beneath the statue of Pompey was intended as a symbolic restoration of republican virtue, but it only plunged Rome into a new round of civil wars that would finally destroy the constitutional system the conspirators had sought to save. Brutus and Cassius, the noblest Romans of their generation, discovered that republican ideals could not survive the realities of imperial governance. Their assassination of Caesar was a moral victory and a political disaster, for they had destroyed the man without addressing the conditions that had made his rise to power inevitable. The republic they sought to restore had already died. Caesar had merely provided its funeral. The aftermath of Caesar's assassination revealed the extent to which Roman political culture had been transformed by a century of civil war. The Roman people, who should have celebrated the restoration of their freedom, instead mourned the loss of a leader who had provided them with stability and prosperity. Mark Antony's funeral oration over Caesar's body inflamed popular sentiment against the liberators, forcing them to flee the city they had sought to save. The formation of the Second Triumvirate by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus represented the Republic's final agony. The triumvirs' proscription lists exceeded even Sulla's in their scope and brutality, as political opponents were hunted down and murdered throughout Italy. Cicero, the Republic's greatest orator and its most eloquent defender, was killed on Antony's orders, his severed hands nailed to the rostra from which he had delivered his greatest speeches. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE saw the final defeat of Republican forces and the suicide of Brutus and Cassius, the last champions of the old order. Their deaths marked the end of a political tradition that had governed Rome for nearly 5 centuries, as the Republic's defenders chose death rather than submission to autocratic rule. The division of the Roman world between Octavian and Antony after Philippi was merely a temporary expedient, for the empire was too small to contain 2 masters. The final act of the Republic's destruction would be played out in the eastern Mediterranean, where Cleopatra's dreams of Hellenistic monarchy would merge with Antony's ambitions to create the last threat to Roman unity. The Republic's death had been long and agonizing, marked by constitutional violations, political murders, and civil wars that had consumed a generation of Romans. In the smoking ruins of the old order, a new form of government was about to emerge, one that would abandon the pretense of popular sovereignty while preserving the forms of republican institutions. From the ashes of civil war and the ruins of republican idealism emerged a political genius whose name would become synonymous with imperial transformation. Octavian, the sickly youth who had inherited Caesar's name and fortune, proved to possess a subtle understanding of Roman psychology that enabled him to accomplish what no predecessor had managed: the creation of a stable autocracy that Romans could accept without abandoning their cherished republican identity. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was more than a naval engagement. It was the final confrontation between 2 irreconcilable visions of Rome's future. Antony and Cleopatra represented the Hellenistic model of personal monarchy, with its divine kingship and oriental luxury. Octavian embodied a peculiarly Roman solution to the problem of empire, autocracy disguised as restored republicanism, monarchy clothed in the familiar garments of traditional magistracies. The suicide of Antony and Cleopatra in Alexandria marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Roman Egypt, but it also symbolized the death of the last alternative to Octavian's supremacy. With their demise, the Roman world faced a choice between continued civil war and acceptance of a new form of government that promised peace at the price of political freedom. Octavian's genius lay not in his military prowess, which was modest, but in his political intuition. He understood that Romans would accept autocracy if it were presented as the restoration of ancestral customs rather than as a foreign innovation. His gradual accumulation of powers, tribunician authority, imperium maius, pontifex maximus, created a legal foundation for personal rule that seemed to emerge naturally from republican precedents. The settlement of 27 BCE represented a masterpiece of political theatre. Octavian's dramatic offer to restore all his extraordinary powers to the Caesars, a senate and people, was carefully choreographed to produce the desired response, an equally dramatic rejection of his offer, and a renewed grant of authority that appeared to come from popular demand rather than personal ambition. The new title of Augustus, with its religious connotations of divine favour, elevated Octavian above ordinary mortals while avoiding the hated designation of Rex. The Augustan constitution was a complex fiction that satisfied the Roman need for legal continuity while accommodating the practical requirements of imperial governance. The Senate continued to meet and debate. The assemblies continued to elect magistrates. The traditional offices retained their ancient dignities, but real power rested with Augustus, who controlled the armies, the provinces, and the treasury through his overlapping authorities and informal influence. The Praetorian Guard, established as Augustus's personal bodyguard, became the physical embodiment of the new regime's reliance on military force. These elite soldiers, stationed in Rome itself, violated the ancient prohibition against armed troops within the sacred boundary of the city, but their presence ensured that no potential challenger could threaten Augustus's position through political manipulation or popular uprising. The cultural transformation of Rome under Augustus rivaled the political revolution in its scope and significance. The emperor's patronage of poets and artists created a new form of imperial propaganda that celebrated the regime's achievements while subtly promoting its ideological foundations. The Aeneid of Virgil became the unofficial epic of the new order, weaving together Trojan legend, Roman history, and Augustan political philosophy into a narrative that justified imperial rule as the fulfillment of divine destiny. The architectural transformation of Rome reflected Augustus's desire to create a capital worthy of world empire. The Forum of Augustus, the Theatre of Marcellus, the Mausoleum of Augustus, these monuments proclaimed the new regime's permanence and magnificence, while providing employment for the urban masses whose political power had been neutralized by the constitutional settlement. Augustus's famous boast that he had found Rome brick and left it marble was more than architectural vanity. It was a statement about the transformative power of enlightened autocracy. The magnificent buildings that rose throughout the city during his reign served as constant reminders of the benefits that imperial rule could provide to those who accepted its authority. The Augustan marriage legislation represented the regime's attempt to address the moral and demographic crises that had weakened the Republic. The Julian laws on marriage and adultery sought to restore traditional Roman family values while encouraging the birth of legitimate children among the citizen class. These laws revealed Augustus's understanding that political stability required social stability, and that the empire's future depended upon the renewal of the Roman population. The religious revival promoted by Augustus was equally calculated to restore social cohesion and political loyalty. The restoration of ancient temples, the revival of traditional festivals, and the emphasis on Augustus's role as Pontifex Maximus created a new synthesis of religious and political authority that gave divine sanction to imperial rule. The imperial cult, which began as spontaneous expressions of gratitude in the provinces, gradually evolved into an organized system of emperor worship that strengthened the bonds between ruler and subject. The Augustan peace transformed the Mediterranean world by ending the cycle of civil wars that had devastated the late Republic. The closing of the Temple of Janus, which had remained open during times of war for over 2 centuries, symbolized the new era of tranquility that imperial rule had brought to the Roman world. Trade flourished, cities grew, and provincials experienced unprecedented prosperity under the protection of Roman law and Roman arms. The administrative system established by Augustus created the institutional framework that would govern the Roman Empire for the next 3 centuries. The division of provinces between imperial and senatorial administration reflected the careful balance between old and new that characterized the Augustan settlement. The creation of a professional civil service, recruited from the equestrian order, provided the technical expertise necessary for governing a world empire while preserving the dignity of senatorial rank. The military reforms implemented by Augustus addressed one of the fundamental problems that had destroyed the Republic: the loyalty of professional armies to individual commanders rather than to the state. The establishment of fixed terms of service, regular pay scales, and veteran settlement colonies created a military system that was both effective and politically reliable. The legions swore their oath to Augustus personally, but their loyalty was reinforced by systematic benefits that made imperial service attractive to ambitious young Romans. The succession problem that would plague the empire throughout its history was already apparent during Augustus's reign. His adoption of Tiberius as heir represented an acknowledgement that the new system required dynastic continuity, but it also revealed the difficulty of reconciling autocratic rule with republican sensibilities. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that emerged from Augustus's family arrangements would demonstrate both the stability and the dangers inherent in hereditary monarchy. The provincial system established by Augustus created a new form of imperialism that emphasized local autonomy within imperial unity. Provincial elites were encouraged to adopt Roman customs and to seek Roman citizenship, while local traditions were preserved and respected. This policy of cultural assimilation created a new form of imperial identity that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries while preserving regional diversity. The economic prosperity that characterized the Augustan age reflected the benefits of political stability and administrative efficiency. The imperial currency system, standardized weights and measures, and coordinated tax collection created conditions for commercial expansion that had been impossible during the chaos of the late Republic. The wealth that flowed into imperial coffers from provincial tribute funded the public works and military forces that maintained the system's stability. Augustus's literary patronage created a golden age of Latin literature that celebrated the values and achievements of the new order while establishing cultural models that would influence Western civilization for millennia. The poets and historians who flourished under imperial patronage, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Livy, created works that defined Roman cultural identity and promoted the imperial ideology through artistic excellence rather than crude propaganda. The moral ambiguity of the Augustan achievement was apparent even to contemporaries. The regime had brought peace, prosperity, and good government to the Roman world, but at the cost of the political freedom that Romans had cherished for 5 centuries. The empire was more just and efficient than the Republic had been, but it was also more restrictive and autocratic. As Augustus lay dying in 14 CE, after a reign of 45 years, he could survey an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Sahara to the Rhine. The Roman world was at peace, the frontiers were secure, the provinces were prosperous, and the capital was magnificent. Yet the price of this achievement was the transformation of Roman citizens into imperial subjects, of republican virtue into imperial loyalty, of political participation into passive obedience. The Augustan settlement had solved the immediate problems that had destroyed the Republic, but it had created new challenges that would test the empire's resilience in the centuries to come. The succession of Tiberius marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history, one that would reveal whether the institutions created by Augustus could survive the rule of less capable successors. The death of Augustus cast a long shadow over the Palatine Hill, where the new emperor Tiberius assumed the burden of ruling a world that his predecessor had transformed beyond recognition. The man who inherited the purple was a reluctant autocrat, a republican by temperament forced to play the role of emperor by the inexorable logic of political necessity. His reign would reveal both the strengths and the fatal weaknesses of the system Augustus had created. Tiberius brought to the imperial office qualities that would have made him an exemplary republican magistrate: military competence, administrative skill, personal austerity, and a deep respect for law and tradition. Yet these very virtues proved inadequate for the demands of imperial rule, which required not just competence but charisma, not just respect for law but the ability to transcend it, not just administrative skill but the theatrical genius necessary to maintain the illusion of popular government while exercising autocratic power. The early years of Tiberius's reign demonstrated the empire's capacity for sound governance under competent leadership. The provinces were administered with unprecedented efficiency. The frontiers were secured through diplomatic skill rather than military force, and the imperial treasury accumulated surpluses that would fund public works for decades. Yet these achievements were overshadowed by the emperor's growing isolation and the poisonous atmosphere of suspicion that gradually consumed the imperial court. The rise of Sejanus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard, revealed the empire's vulnerability to palace intrigue and the corruption of those closest to power. Sejanus's systematic elimination of potential rivals, his manipulation of treason trials, and his apparent plan to supplant the Julio-Claudian dynasty demonstrated how quickly the imperial system could be subverted by those who understood its weaknesses. Tiberius's withdrawal to Capri in 26 CE marked a turning point in imperial history, the first time an emperor had abandoned the capital for extended periods, leaving the government in the hands of subordinates whose loyalty was questionable. The magnificent villa that Tiberius constructed on the island became a symbol of imperial isolation, a physical manifestation of the psychological distance that separated the emperor from the people he ruled. The treason trials that proliferated during the later years of Tiberius's reign created an atmosphere of terror that would haunt the empire for decades. The law of majestas, originally designed to protect the dignity of the Roman people, was perverted into an instrument of imperial tyranny that made any criticism of the emperor a capital offense. The informers who proliferated during this period became symbols of the moral corruption that absolute power inevitably produced. The accession of Caligula in 37 CE was initially greeted with relief and celebration throughout the empire. The young emperor's promise to restore the constitutional practices abandoned by his predecessor, his generous distribution of bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the people, and his apparent respect for senatorial dignity suggested that the empire might return to the benevolent autocracy of Augustus. Yet, within months of his accession, Caligula had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than a reluctant autocrat, a megalomaniac whose unlimited power had unleashed psychological forces that threatened the stability of the entire imperial system. His demands for divine honors, his construction of a temple to his own godhead, and his apparent belief in his own supernatural powers demonstrated the corrupting influence of absolute authority on a mind unprepared for its burdens. The emperor's increasingly erratic behavior, his appointment of his horse as consul, his plan to move the capital to Alexandria, his intention to invade Britain for the sole purpose of collecting seashells, revealed the extent to which imperial power could be divorced from rational governance. Caligula's reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hereditary succession and the need for institutional safeguards against imperial madness. The assassination of Caligula by officers of the Praetorian Guard in 41 CE demonstrated both the empire's capacity for self-correction and its dependence on military force for political stability. The discovery of Claudius cowering behind a curtain in the imperial palace, his elevation to the purple by soldiers seeking a plausible candidate for emperor, revealed the essentially military foundation of imperial authority beneath its constitutional facade. Claudius proved to be one of the most effective emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, despite his physical disabilities and the circumstances of his accession. His scholarly approach to administration, his respect for legal precedent, and his systematic expansion of Roman citizenship created a model of enlightened imperial governance that would influence his successors for generations. The conquest of Britain under Claudius represented the empire's last major territorial expansion for over a century. The successful invasion of the mysterious island beyond the ocean demonstrated Rome's continued military superiority while providing the emperor with the military glory necessary to legitimize his rule. The incorporation of Britain into the imperial system extended Roman civilization to its northernmost limits and completed the empire's domination of the Atlantic world. Claudius's innovations in imperial administration reflected his understanding that effective governance required adaptation to changing circumstances. His expansion of the imperial bureaucracy, his creation of specialized departments for different aspects of government, and his systematic codification of legal procedures established administrative practices that would endure for centuries. The emperor's marriage to his niece Agrippina represented both a personal disaster and a political calculation that would have profound consequences for the dynasty's future. Agrippina's ambition to place her son Nero on the throne, her systematic elimination of potential rivals, and her manipulation of the aging emperor demonstrated the dangerous influence that imperial women could exercise behind the scenes of formal government. The adoption of Nero as Claudius's heir marked a return to the hereditary principle that had produced Caligula's disastrous reign. The young prince's education under the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus suggested that the empire might benefit from enlightened leadership, but his artistic temperament and lack of interest in administration raised questions about his fitness for imperial responsibility. The death of Claudius in 54 CE, possibly by poison administered by Agrippina, brought to power an emperor whose reign would epitomize both the cultural achievements and the moral corruption of the Julio-Claudian period. Nero's early years demonstrated the benefits of competent advisors and institutional continuity, but his later reign revealed the destructive potential of imperial power exercised without restraint or accountability. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, guided by Seneca and Burrus, represented a golden age of imperial administration. The emperor's respect for senatorial dignity, his careful attention to legal procedures, and his generous support for public works created an atmosphere of optimism that recalled the best years of Augustus. The provinces prospered under efficient administration, the frontiers remained secure, and the capital enjoyed unprecedented prosperity. Yet even during this halcyon period, signs of future troubles were apparent to those who knew how to read them. Nero's passion for artistic performance, his neglect of military affairs, and his growing resentment of constitutional limitations suggested that the empire was governed by an emperor whose interests lay elsewhere than in the mundane requirements of administration and defense. The murder of Agrippina in 59 CE marked Nero's liberation from maternal influence and his transformation into an autocrat answerable to no one. The emperor's decision to eliminate the woman who had placed him on the throne demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his understanding that imperial power could not be shared, even with family members who had claims to influence. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE provided Nero with the opportunity to rebuild the capital according to his own architectural vision, but it also created suspicions about his role in the disaster that would haunt his memory for centuries. Whether or not the emperor actually fiddled while Rome burned, his apparent indifference to popular suffering and his exploitation of the tragedy for personal glorification revealed the growing disconnect between ruler and ruled. The persecution of Christians following the Great Fire marked a new chapter in the empire's relationship with religious minorities. Nero's use of the Christians as scapegoats for the fire's devastation established a precedent for imperial persecution that would influence church-state relations for centuries. The martyrdom of Peter and Paul during this persecution gave the emerging Christian church its first imperial martyrs and strengthened its appeal among those who suffered under imperial oppression. The revolt in Judea that erupted in 66 CE revealed the limits of Roman tolerance for religious and cultural diversity, the Jewish rejection of imperial cult, worship, their resistance to Roman taxation, and their apocalyptic expectations of divine deliverance created a conflict that could only be resolved through military force. The siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple would mark the end of Second Temple Judaism and the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. The growing opposition to Nero's rule among the senatorial class, the military, and the provincial elite demonstrated the empire's capacity for resistance to tyrannical government. The conspiracy of Piso in 65 CE, though unsuccessful, revealed the breadth of discontent with an emperor whose artistic pretensions and moral corruption had alienated the traditional supporters of imperial authority. The revolt of Vindex in Gaul and the subsequent defection of the Spanish legions under Galba marked the beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's suicide in 68 CE, accompanied by his theatrical lament that "What an artist dies in me," symbolized the corruption of imperial ideals and the need for renewal under new leadership. The year of the 4 emperors that followed Nero's death revealed both the instability inherent in the imperial system and its remarkable capacity for regeneration. The rapid succession of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius demonstrated the empire's vulnerability to military coups and civil war, but the ultimate victory of Vespasian proved that capable leadership could restore stability and legitimate authority. The Flavian dynasty that emerged from the chaos of 68 to 69 CE represented a return to the practical virtues that had made Augustus's settlement successful. Vespasian's humble origins, his military competence, and his down-to-earth approach to government provided a refreshing contrast to the theatrical excesses of his Julio-Claudian predecessors. The ascension of Trajan to the imperial purple in 98 CE marked the beginning of an era that would witness the Roman Empire reach its greatest territorial extent and its highest expression of imperial virtues. Born in Spain to a family of provincial nobility, Trajan embodied the empire's evolution from an Italian city-state into a truly Mediterranean civilization that drew its strength from the diverse peoples united under Roman law. Trajan's reign opened with campaigns that would extend Roman dominion into regions that previous emperors had deemed beyond the empire's reach. The conquest of Dacia, the gold-rich kingdom beyond the Danube, represented more than mere territorial expansion. It was a statement that Roman power knew no natural boundaries, that the empire's destiny was limited only by the courage and vision of its leaders. The Dacian Wars revealed Trajan at the height of his military genius. The construction of a stone bridge across the Danube, a feat of engineering that amazed contemporaries and continues to inspire wonder today, symbolized Rome's ability to overcome any natural obstacle through the application of systematic planning and technological innovation. The bridge itself became a metaphor for the empire's role as a civilizing force, connecting barbarian lands to the Mediterranean world through the extension of Roman engineering, Roman law, and Roman culture. The wealth that flowed into Rome from the Dacian gold mines funded the most ambitious building program in the empire's history. Trajan's Forum, with its magnificent column chronicling the Dacian campaigns, became the architectural centerpiece of imperial Rome. The column itself, with its spiral narrative carved in marble, represented a new form of historical consciousness, the empire's ability to transform military conquest into enduring artistic achievement. The conquest of Armenia and Mesopotamia carried Roman eagles to the furthest point they would ever reach. Trajan's advance to the Persian Gulf represented the fulfillment of dreams that had haunted Roman imagination since the days of Alexander, the creation of a universal empire that would unite East and West under Roman rule. For a brief moment, it seemed that the entire civilized world might acknowledge Roman supremacy, Yet even at the moment of greatest triumph, the limits of imperial expansion became apparent. The Jewish revolt that erupted throughout the eastern provinces while Trajan campaigned in Mesopotamia revealed the fragility of Roman control over populations that had never fully accepted imperial authority. The emperor's decision to abandon his Mesopotamian conquests rather than face prolonged warfare on multiple fronts demonstrated a strategic wisdom that would influence imperial policy for generations. The accession of Hadrian marked a fundamental shift in imperial strategy from expansion to consolidation. Where Trajan had sought to extend Roman boundaries, Hadrian focused on strengthening what already existed. His travels throughout the provinces, his personal inspection of frontier defenses, and his attention to local administration created a new model of imperial leadership based on direct engagement with the practical problems of governing a world empire. Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern Britain from sea to sea, became the most famous symbol of imperial limits. The wall was more than a military fortification. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of Roman civilization and its relationship with the barbarian world beyond. The decision to construct a permanent barrier rather than continue the process of conquest represented a mature recognition that even Roman power had limits, and that security lay in defense rather than endless expansion. The emperor's passion for Greek culture and philosophy created a new synthesis of Roman political pragmatism and Hellenic intellectual sophistication. His rebuilding of Athens, his initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, and his deification of his beloved Antinous demonstrated the empire's capacity to absorb and transform diverse cultural traditions while maintaining its essential Roman character. The founding of Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem marked the empire's definitive rejection of Jewish particularism and its insistence that all peoples must accept Roman universal values. The Bar Kokhba revolt that followed represented the last attempt by Jewish nationalism to resist imperial integration, and its failure ensured that Judaism would survive only as a diaspora religion rather than as a territorial nation. Antoninus Pius inherited an empire at peace and devoted his 23-year reign to maintaining the stability and prosperity that his predecessors had achieved. His reign represented the fulfillment of Augustus's vision of imperial government, efficient administration, benevolent rule, and the systematic extension of Roman law and Roman culture throughout the civilized world. The legal developments that occurred during Antoninus's reign established principles that would influence jurisprudence for millennia. The work of jurists like Gaius, whose institutes became the foundation of legal education throughout the Western world, demonstrated Rome's greatest intellectual achievement, the creation of a systematic body of law based on reason rather than tradition, on universal principles rather than local customs. Marcus Aurelius ascended to the throne in 161 CE as the culmination of the adoptive system that had given Rome a century of competent rulers. A philosopher trained in Stoic principles, Marcus Aurelius embodied the ideal of the philosopher King Tone, had Plato had imagined but never seen realized. His meditations, written during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, represent the most profound expression of imperial consciousness in ancient literature. Yet Marcus Aurelius's reign also marked the beginning of challenges that would test the empire's resilience. The Antonine Plague, which swept through the Roman world in the 160s and 170s, represented the first pandemic disease to affect the empire on a massive scale. The demographic and economic consequences of the plague created problems that would influence imperial development for centuries. The Germanic wars that consumed much of Marcus Aurelius's reign revealed new pressures on the northern frontier. The Marcomanni and their allies represented a new type of barbarian threat, not merely raiding parties seeking plunder, but entire peoples seeking new lands on which to settle. The emperor's decision to spend his final years campaigning on the Danube rather than enjoying the pleasures of Rome demonstrated his understanding that imperial security required constant vigilance and personal sacrifice. The philosophical writings that Marcus Aurelius composed during these campaigns revealed the spiritual costs of imperial rule. His meditations on duty, mortality, and the proper relationship between individual desire and public responsibility created a literature of imperial introspection that had no precedent in ancient writing. The emperor who commanded the loyalty of millions wrote with profound loneliness about the isolation that absolute power imposed upon those who wielded it. The architectural achievements of the Antonine period represented the culmination of Roman engineering and artistic skill. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian with its revolutionary concrete dome, became a temple to all gods that symbolized the empire's religious universalism. The baths of Caracalla, the column of Marcus Aurelius, the architectural complexes that adorned cities throughout the provinces, these monuments proclaimed the empire's cultural supremacy and its ability to transform utilitarian structures into works of enduring beauty. The legal reforms implemented during this period established the framework for imperial administration that would endure until the empire's fall. The standardization of legal procedures, the extension of citizenship to increasing numbers of provincials, and the systematic codification of imperial law created a unified legal culture that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The empire had become not just a political entity, but a legal community in which all free inhabitants shared common rights and obligations. The economic prosperity of the Antonine Age was built upon the foundation of imperial peace and efficient administration. Trade routes that stretched from Britain to India carried goods and ideas across vast distances, creating a level of commercial integration that would not be seen again until the modern era. The Roman currency system provided a stable medium of exchange that facilitated commerce throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The cultural flowering that accompanied this economic prosperity produced literary and artistic achievements that rivaled those of the Augustan age. Tacitus's penetrating analyses of imperial politics, Plutarch's biographical studies of great men, Juvenal's satirical portraits of contemporary society. These works created a literature that combined Roman practical wisdom with Greek intellectual sophistication. The provincial cities that flourished during this period became showcases of Roman urban civilization. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and dozens of smaller centers developed architectural complexes that rivaled Rome itself in their magnificence. The amphitheaters, theaters, forums, and baths that adorned these cities demonstrated the empire's success in extending its cultural values to the furthest corners of the known world. The religious syncretism that characterized the Antonine period reflected the empire's capacity to absorb diverse spiritual traditions while maintaining essential unity. The cults of Mithras, Isis, and Cybele flourished alongside traditional Roman deities, creating a religious landscape that offered spiritual satisfaction to people of varied cultural backgrounds. Christianity, though still a minority religion, began to attract converts from all social classes and to develop the institutional structures that would eventually transform it into an imperial church. The educational system that developed during this period created a common intellectual culture that united the empire's diverse populations. Rhetorical schools in Athens, Alexandria, and Massilia trained young Romans in the arts of oratory and literature that were essential for advancement in imperial service. The emphasis on Greek and Latin literature created a shared cultural vocabulary that enabled communication across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The transportation infrastructure that connected all parts of the empire reached its greatest development during the Antonine period. The Roman road system, supplemented by an extensive network of sea routes, created conditions for rapid communication and efficient administration that amazed contemporary observers. The postal service that carried imperial communications from Britain to Mesopotamia operated with a speed and reliability that would not be matched again for over a millennium. The military reforms implemented during this period adapted Roman armies to the changing nature of frontier warfare, The increasing recruitment of auxiliary units from barbarian peoples, the development of new tactical formations to counter cavalry-based enemies, and the construction of elaborate frontier fortifications created a military system capable of defending the empire's vast perimeter against diverse threats. Yet even at the height of imperial achievement, perceptive observers could detect signs of future challenges. The increasing cost of frontier defense, the growing importance of barbarian auxiliaries in Roman armies, and the demographic impact of plague and warfare created strains that would test the empire's resilience in the coming centuries. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE at Vindobona on the Danube frontier marked the end of the Antonine Golden Age and the beginning of a new phase in imperial history. His decision to leave the throne to his biological son Commodus rather than continuing the adoptive system represented a return to hereditary succession with all its attendant risks. The empire that Marcus Aurelius bequeathed to his successor stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the cataracts of the Nile, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Euphrates Valley. It encompassed perhaps 60 million people, speaking dozens of languages but united under Roman law and Roman administration. It was the largest political entity the world had ever seen and the most successful attempt at universal government in human history. Yet the very magnitude of this achievement contained within it the seeds of future transformation. The empire had reached the limits of expansion possible with ancient technology and administrative methods. The frontiers could be maintained but not significantly extended. The population could be governed but not indefinitely increased. The economic system could provide prosperity but not unlimited growth. The Antonine Age had proven that human civilization could achieve remarkable heights when guided by rational principles and competent leadership. The legal system, the architectural achievements, the literary and artistic accomplishments of this period would influence Western civilization for millennia. Yet it had also demonstrated the fragility of human achievement and the constant vigilance required to maintain civilized order against the forces of chaos and barbarism. As the sun set over the Antonine Empire, casting its golden light across monuments that seemed destined for eternity, few could have imagined the challenges that lay ahead. The empire appeared to have achieved a stability that might endure forever, a prosperity that seemed guaranteed by Roman virtue and Roman institutions. Yet history would soon reveal that even the greatest human achievements are subject to the inexorable forces of change, and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against both external threats and internal decay. The eagles that had flown so high for so long would soon face storms that would test their ability to soar, and the empire that had seemed so permanent would discover that nothing in human affairs endures forever, save the memory of greatness and the hope that such achievements might inspire future generations to similar heights. The assassination of Commodus on the last day of 192 CE shattered the illusion of imperial stability that had sustained the Roman world for nearly a century. The mad emperor's death in his bath, strangled by an athlete he had humiliated, marked not merely the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a crisis that would test every assumption about Roman government, Roman society, and Roman civilization itself. The year 193 CE witnessed a spectacle that would have horrified the founders of the empire: the auction of imperial authority by the Praetorian Guard. When Didius Julianus purchased the purple for 25,000 sesterces per guardsman, he unwittingly revealed the mercenary foundation that had always lurked beneath the constitutional facade of imperial government. The empire that had once been governed by philosopher kings was now ruled by the highest bidder. Yet even this degradation paled before the chaos that followed. 3 claimants to imperial authority, Septimius Severus in Pannonia, Piscenius Niger in Syria, and Clodius Albinus in Britain, each commanded legions loyal to their personal authority rather than to any abstract principle of legitimate government. The civil wars that engulfed the empire for the next 4 years revealed the extent to which Roman political culture had been militarized and the degree to which imperial unity depended upon the personal qualities of individual rulers. Septimius Severus emerged victorious from this contest not through superior principles, but through superior strategy and greater ruthlessness. His advice to his sons, enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, became the unofficial motto of 3rd century government, revealing the transformation of the empire from a constitutional state into a military despotism dependent upon the loyalty of professional armies. The Severan dynasty that followed represented both the empire's adaptation to new realities and its abandonment of traditional limitations on imperial power. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, which extended Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, marked the culmination of a process that had begun with Augustus, the transformation of the Roman Empire from an Italian confederacy into a universal state that transcended ethnic and geographical boundaries. Yet this apparent triumph of Roman universalism masked deeper problems that would prove intractable. The extension of citizenship to millions of provincials diluted the meaning of Roman identity, while failing to address the fundamental tensions between center and periphery, between military and civilian authority, between imperial ideology and provincial reality. The Severan emphasis on military expenditure and frontier defense created fiscal pressures that would haunt the empire for centuries. The systematic debasement of the currency, begun as an emergency measure to fund military campaigns, became a permanent feature of imperial finance that destroyed the economic stability upon which Antonine prosperity had rested. The inflation that resulted from monetary debasement undermined the savings of the middle classes and created social tensions that no amount of imperial largesse could resolve. The cultural transformation of the empire during this period reflected the changing composition of its ruling elite. The Syrian influences that pervaded the court of the Severans, the religious innovations promoted by empresses like Julia Domna and Julia Maesa, and the syncretistic cults that flourished throughout the provinces created a cultural landscape that would have been alien to Marcus Aurelius or Hadrian. The assassination of Alexander Severus in 235 CE by mutinous soldiers marked the beginning of 50 years of almost continuous civil war, foreign invasion, and economic collapse. The empire that had once seemed eternal now appeared to be disintegrating before the eyes of contemporaries who had grown up believing in the permanence of Roman institutions and the inevitability of Roman success. The period from 235 to 284 CE witnessed the proclamation of at least 50 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths within months or even weeks of their accession. The rapid succession of military commanders who claimed imperial authority revealed the complete breakdown of constitutional government and the reduction of imperial politics to a struggle between competing army factions. The Germanic invasions that devastated the northern provinces during this period represented a new type of threat that the traditional Roman military system was ill-equipped to handle. Unlike the organized kingdoms that Rome had previously confronted, these barbarian confederations possessed the mobility and desperation that made them virtually impossible to defeat through conventional tactics. The sack of cities like Athens and Antioch by Gothic raiders demonstrated that even the most civilized and well-defended centers of imperial culture were vulnerable to barbarian assault. The economic crisis that accompanied military and political collapse created conditions of hardship that affected every level of society. The abandonment of farms in frontier regions, the disruption of trade routes by warfare and piracy, and the collapse of the currency system created a subsistence economy that could barely support the military forces necessary for imperial defense. The plague that swept through the empire during this period compounded the demographic and economic disasters created by warfare and invasion. The reduction in population, particularly in the urban centers that had been the backbone of imperial administration, created labor shortages that could not be remedied by traditional methods of recruitment and slavery. The religious transformation of the empire during the crisis reflected the psychological impact of seemingly endless catastrophe. Traditional Roman religion, with its emphasis on civic virtue and divine favor earned through ritual observance, seemed inadequate to explain or remedy the disasters that had befallen the empire. Mystery religions, Christianity, and various forms of Eastern spirituality offered alternative explanations for suffering and hope for redemption that appealed to populations traumatized by decades of warfare and uncertainty. The emergence of breakaway empires in Gaul and Palmyra during the 260s revealed the extent to which imperial unity had been compromised by the central government's inability to provide effective defense or administration. The Gallic Empire of Postumus and his successors, which controlled Britain, Gaul, and Spain for more than a decade, demonstrated that provincial populations were willing to accept alternative forms of government if the legitimate emperor could not protect them from barbarian invasion or economic collapse. The Palmyrene Empire of Zenobia represented an even more dramatic challenge to Roman authority. Her claim to rule the entire Eastern Empire in the name of her infant son, her adoption of imperial titles and insignia, and her successful resistance to Roman attempts at reconquest revealed the fragility of imperial control over populations that possessed their own cultural traditions and political aspirations. Yet even in the depths of crisis, the empire demonstrated a remarkable capacity for regeneration and adaptation. Emperors like Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and Probus proved that competent leadership could still rally imperial resources and restore effective government even under the most adverse circumstances. Aurelian's reconquest of the breakaway empires and his construction of new walls around Rome demonstrated both the persistence of imperial ideology and the adaptation of imperial institutions to new realities. His title, Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, reflected contemporary understanding that the empire had indeed been saved from imminent dissolution and restored to something approaching its former greatness. The religious innovations of this period, particularly the promotion of solar monotheism by emperors like Aurelian, revealed the empire's search for new sources of ideological unity that might transcend the ethnic and cultural divisions that had been exacerbated by political crisis. The identification of the emperor with the unconquered sun provided a theological foundation for imperial authority that appealed to diverse populations while maintaining connections to traditional Roman religious concepts. The military reforms implemented during this period created the foundation for the imperial recovery that would follow. The development of mobile field armies, the systematic recruitment of barbarian federates, and the construction of defense in depth along the frontiers represented adaptations to strategic realities that would influence imperial military organization for centuries. The administrative changes that emerged from the crisis, the separation of civil and military authority, the multiplication of provinces to ensure closer supervision, and the development of new mechanisms for imperial communication created governmental structures that proved more effective than their predecessors in coping with the challenges of ruling a vast and diverse empire. As the 3rd century drew to its close, the empire that emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the state that had collapsed in 235 CE. The military despotism that had replaced constitutional government, the religious syncretism that had supplanted traditional Roman culture, and the economic regimentation that had succeeded free market capitalism created a new form of imperial civilization that was both more authoritarian and more inclusive than its predecessor. The reforms of Diocletian, which would formally inaugurate this new phase of imperial development, represented not the restoration of the old order, but the creation of something unprecedented in human history, a totalitarian state that claimed authority over every aspect of human life while maintaining the fiction of continuity with republican and early imperial traditions. The crisis of the 3rd century had tested the Roman Empire to its very foundations and found those foundations strong enough to support a new structure, different from but recognizably related to what had come before. The empire had survived, but it had been transformed in the process, and the transformations were only beginning. From the ashes of the 3rd century's chaos emerged a figure whose vision would reshape not only the Roman Empire, but the entire course of Western civilization. Diocletian, the Illyrian soldier who seized power in 284 CE, understood that the empire's survival required nothing less than its complete reconstruction along lines that would have been unthinkable to Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. The tetrarchy that Diocletian established represented a radical departure from the constitutional principles that had governed the empire for 3 centuries. 4 rulers, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, would share imperial authority according to a carefully crafted system of geographical division and planned succession. This multiplication of imperial authority reflected Diocletian's recognition that the empire had become too vast and complex to be governed by a single individual, no matter how capable. The price system that Diocletian's government promulgated in 31 CE revealed the extent to which the empire had moved toward economic regimentation. The systematic regulation of wages and prices throughout the imperial territories represented an unprecedented assertion of state authority over commercial transactions that had previously been governed by market forces. Though the edict ultimately proved unenforceable, it demonstrated the new regime's willingness to subordinate individual economic freedom to the demands of imperial stability. The persecution of Christians that began in 303 CE represented Diocletian's attempt to restore religious unity through the elimination of what he perceived as a subversive foreign cult. The systematic destruction of churches, the burning of Christian scriptures, and the execution of those who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods revealed the empire's recognition that Christianity had become a significant alternative to imperial ideology that could not be ignored or assimilated. Yet even as Diocletian sought to strengthen traditional Roman religion through persecution, the social and cultural forces that favored Christianity continued to operate throughout the empire. The appeal of Christian monotheism to populations that had lost faith in traditional polytheism, the organizational effectiveness of Christian communities during periods of crisis, and the moral authority that Christian leaders had acquired through their willingness to suffer martyrdom, created conditions that no amount of imperial persecution could reverse. The collapse of the Tetrarchy after Diocletian's abdication in 305 CE demonstrated that even the most carefully planned constitutional arrangements could not overcome the fundamental problem of imperial succession. The civil wars that followed revealed that personal ambition and military loyalty remained more powerful forces than institutional innovation in determining political outcomes. Constantine's rise to power represented both the culmination of 3rd century military despotism and the beginning of a new phase in imperial development that would transform the empire's relationship with religion, culture, and society. His victory at the Milvian Bridge in 32 CE was attributed to divine intervention by the Christian god, marking the beginning of a partnership between church and state that would define European civilization for over a millennium. The Edict of Milan in 1330 established the principle of religious toleration that ended the age of persecution and created conditions for Christianity's transformation from a persecuted minority into the empire's dominant religion. Constantine's personal conversion, whether motivated by sincere conviction or political calculation, provided Christianity with imperial patronage that would prove decisive in its competition with traditional paganism. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE represented the empire's attempt to resolve the theological disputes that threatened to divide Christianity into irreconcilable factions. Constantine's personal presiding over the council demonstrated the extent to which imperial authority had become involved in religious questions that previous emperors had regarded as beyond their competence. The Nicene Creed that emerged from the council established orthodox Christian doctrine while revealing the degree to which theological unity required imperial enforcement. The founding of Constantinople as a new Rome on the site of ancient Byzantium represented the most dramatic symbol of the empire's transformation. The new capital, constructed according to Christian principles and adorned with churches rather than temples, embodied Constantine's vision of a Christian empire that would fulfill the imperial mission while transcending the limitations of pagan civilization. The geographical relocation of imperial authority from Rome to Constantinople reflected the empire's recognition that the Mediterranean center of gravity had shifted eastward. The wealth of Egypt and Asia Minor, the strategic importance of the Bosphorus, and the concentration of population in the eastern provinces made Constantinople a more logical capital for governing a world empire than the ancient city on the Tiber. The administrative reforms that Constantine implemented built upon Diocletian's innovations while adapting them to the needs of a Christian empire. The separation of civil and military authority, the multiplication of administrative offices, and the development of an elaborate court ceremony created governmental structures that could manage the complexity of ruling a diverse empire while maintaining the dignity necessary for imperial authority. The economic policies of the Constantinian period represented an attempt to restore fiscal stability through the introduction of a new gold currency and the systematic taxation of agricultural production. The solidus that Constantine minted became the standard of value throughout the Mediterranean world, providing monetary stability that facilitated trade and administration for centuries. The social legislation of this period reflected the influence of Christian values on imperial policy. Laws restricting divorce, prohibiting infanticide, and protecting slaves from excessive punishment demonstrated the empire's attempt to align its legal system with Christian moral teaching while maintaining the social hierarchy upon which imperial administration depended. The military reorganization that Constantine completed created the foundation for imperial defense that would endure until the empire's fall. The development of mobile field armies, the systematic recruitment of barbarian federates, and the construction of fortified frontiers represented adaptations to strategic realities that reflected both Roman military experience and barbarian military innovations. The cultural transformation of the empire during this period was as significant as its political and administrative changes. The replacement of classical education with Christian instruction, the transformation of artistic traditions to serve religious purposes, and the development of new forms of literature and music created a cultural synthesis that combined Greco-Roman intellectual traditions with Christian spiritual values. The reign of Julian the Apostate from 361 to 363 CE represented the last attempt to reverse the Constantinian revolution and restore traditional Roman religion. Julian's philosophical sophistication, his administrative competence, and his personal charisma demonstrated that paganism could still attract intelligent and capable adherents, but his death during the Persian campaign ended any realistic possibility of de-Christianizing the empire. The reigns of Theodosius I and his successors completed the transformation of the empire into a Christian state through the systematic suppression of pagan worship and the establishment of Orthodox Christianity as the exclusive religion of imperial civilization. The closing of the last pagan temples, the prohibition of traditional festivals, and the destruction of classical art and literature marked the end of a cultural tradition that had flourished for over a millennium. The barbarian invasions that intensified during this period created new challenges that tested the empire's capacity for adaptation and survival. The settlement of Gothic federates within imperial territory, the recruitment of barbarian officers into the imperial army, and the gradual barbarization of imperial administration represented attempts to manage demographic and military pressures that could not be resolved through traditional methods. The theological controversies that consumed imperial attention during this period, Arianism, Nestorianism, monophysitism, revealed the difficulty of maintaining religious unity in an empire that encompassed diverse cultural traditions and theological perspectives. The imperial attempts to resolve these disputes through councils and creeds demonstrated both the political importance of religious questions and the limitations of imperial authority in matters of conscience and belief. The division of the empire between Eastern and Western administrations reflected recognition that the imperial territories had become too extensive and diverse to be effectively governed from a single center. Though the emperors who ruled the two halves continued to regard themselves as colleagues rather than rivals, the practical independence of the Western and Eastern empires created conditions that would eventually lead to their separate development. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE shocked contemporaries who had believed that the Eternal City was protected by divine favor and imperial strength. The Visigothic occupation of the capital demonstrated that even the most sacred symbols of imperial authority were vulnerable to barbarian assault, and that the empire's survival could no longer be taken for granted. Yet the empire's response to this disaster revealed its continued capacity for adaptation and renewal. The construction of new defenses, the negotiation of treaties with barbarian federates, and the development of new strategies for managing the challenges of governing a diverse and threatened empire demonstrated that Roman administrative skill and political flexibility remained formidable assets in the struggle for survival. The Constantinian revolution had created a new form of imperial civilization that combined Roman administrative efficiency with Christian moral authority, classical learning with theological wisdom, and imperial universalism with religious exclusivity. This synthesis would prove remarkably durable, providing the foundation for Byzantine civilization in the East and influencing the development of medieval Europe in the West. As the 4th century drew to its close, the empire that Constantine had transformed bore little resemblance to the state that Augustus had founded or that Marcus Aurelius had ruled. Yet the continuity of imperial institutions, the persistence of Roman law, and the endurance of imperial ideology demonstrated that the Roman genius for adaptation and synthesis remained as powerful as ever. The great migrations that swept across Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries represented more than military invasions. They were the movement of entire peoples seeking new homes in a world where climatic change, demographic pressure, and political upheaval had made their traditional territories uninhabitable. The Roman Empire, which had long regarded barbarians as enemies to be conquered or allies to be managed, now faced the unprecedented challenge of absorbing populations whose numbers and desperation made traditional policies of exclusion or integration inadequate. The Punic expansion that began in the steppes of Central Asia created a domino effect that would ultimately reshape the ethnic composition of Europe. The pressure that Attila's confederation exerted upon the Germanic tribes along the Danube and Rhine frontiers forced these peoples to seek refuge within imperial territory, not as raiders seeking plunder, but as entire communities seeking permanent settlement. The empire that had once expanded through conquest now faced expansion through immigration, voluntary and involuntary. The Visigothic crossing of the Danube in 376 CE marked the beginning of a new phase in Romano-Barbarian relations. The Gothic refugees who sought imperial protection from Punic pressure were initially welcomed as potential federates who might strengthen imperial defenses while assimilating to Roman culture. Yet the corruption and incompetence of imperial officials who sold rotten food to starving refugees and enslaved Gothic children created conditions that transformed potential allies into implacable enemies. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility that had sustained imperial morale for centuries. The death of Emperor Valens and the destruction of 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army demonstrated that barbarian military capabilities had evolved to match or exceed those of Roman legions. The Gothic cavalry that overwhelmed Roman infantry at Adrianople represented a new form of warfare that made traditional Roman tactics obsolete. Theodosius I's treaty with the Visigoths established the precedent for barbarian settlement within imperial territory under their own leaders and according to their own laws. This Vodus represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Roman practice, acknowledging that the empire could no longer impose cultural assimilation upon peoples who possessed the military strength to resist it. The Visigoths became Romans in name, while remaining Goths in fact. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE traumatized the Mediterranean world by demonstrating that even the Eternal City was vulnerable to barbarian assault. The Visigothic occupation of Rome, though brief and relatively restrained, destroyed the psychological foundations of imperial security and revealed that barbarian leaders could achieve through negotiation what they could not accomplish through military force alone. Alaric's demand for a permanent homeland for his people within imperial territory reflected the transformation of barbarian objectives from temporary raiding to permanent settlement. The Visigoths no longer sought merely to plunder Roman wealth but to participate in Roman civilization as autonomous communities within the imperial framework. This evolution of barbarian goals created new possibilities for accommodation, but also new challenges for imperial administration. The establishment of the Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul and Spain represented the first successful creation of a barbarian state within former imperial territory. Toulouse became the capital of a realm that maintained Roman administrative structures while preserving Gothic cultural identity. The Visigothic legal code, which applies to different laws to Romans and Goths while acknowledging imperial sovereignty, created a model for barbarian kingdoms that would be replicated throughout the Western Empire. The Vandal conquest of North Africa under Genseric demonstrated the vulnerability of the empire's richest provinces to barbarian assault. The loss of Africa's grain shipments and tax revenues created fiscal crises that made it impossible to maintain adequate military forces for frontier defense. The Vandal fleet that controlled the Western Mediterranean from Carthage threatened imperial communications and made coordinated resistance to barbarian expansion virtually impossible. The Punic Confederation under Attila represented the most formidable threat that the empire had ever faced from beyond its frontiers. Attila's ability to unite diverse barbarian peoples under his leadership created a military force that could challenge Roman power throughout Europe. His campaigns in Gaul and Italy demonstrated that even the combined forces of Romans and their barbarian allies could barely contain the Punic war machine. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE marked the high tide of Punic expansion and the last successful cooperation between Roman and barbarian forces in defense of imperial territory. The alliance between Aetius and the Visigothic king Theodoric that defeated Attila's invasion of Gaul demonstrated that Romans and barbarians could work together when faced with threats that endangered their common interests. Attila's invasion of Italy in 452 CE revealed the empire's inability to defend even its heartland against determined barbarian assault. The Punic advance to the gates of Rome was halted not by military resistance, but by papal diplomacy, as Pope Leo I negotiated a withdrawal that saved the capital from destruction while acknowledging the empire's military weakness. The assassination of Aetius in 454 CE by Emperor Valentinian III eliminated the last Roman general capable of coordinating effective resistance to barbarian expansion. Aetius's death, motivated by imperial jealousy of his success, demonstrated the extent to which court intrigue had undermined the empire's capacity for rational decision-making in the face of existential threats. The sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455 CE completed the city's humiliation and demonstrated that barbarian leaders no longer felt constrained by traditional Roman prestige. Genseric's systematic plundering of Roman treasures, including the spoils that Titus had brought from Jerusalem, symbolized the transfer of imperial wealth to barbarian kingdoms that had become the Mediterranean world's new centers of power. The fragmentation of imperial authority in the West during the 460s and 470s reduced the emperor to a figurehead dependent upon barbarian military support. The real rulers of Italy became Germanic generals like Ricimer and Orestes, who used their control of barbarian armies to make and unmake emperors according to their personal interests rather than imperial needs. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE by Odoacer marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, not with dramatic conquest, but with bureaucratic efficiency. Odoacer's decision to rule Italy as a barbarian king, while acknowledging the theoretical sovereignty of the Eastern Emperor, demonstrated that barbarian leaders had learned to manipulate Roman institutions for their own purposes. The Ostrogothic kingdom that Theodoric established in Italy represented the most successful synthesis of Roman and barbarian elements achieved anywhere in the former Western Empire. Theodoric's respect for Roman law and administration, his patronage of classical learning, and his religious tolerance created conditions that allowed Roman civilization to survive under barbarian rule while adapting to new political realities. The Frankish expansion under Clovis demonstrated that barbarian kingdoms could achieve territorial consolidation and cultural assimilation that the late empire had found impossible. Clovis's conversion to Orthodox Christianity, his adoption of Roman administrative practices, and his systematic conquest of rival barbarian kingdoms created the foundation for a new form of European civilization that combined Germanic political traditions with Roman cultural heritage. The survival of Roman law under barbarian rule revealed the continued vitality of Roman intellectual achievements even after the collapse of Roman political authority. The Breviary of Alaric, the Edictum Theodorici, and other barbarian legal codes demonstrated that Germanic kings recognized the superiority of Roman jurisprudence while adapting it to the needs of their subjects. The preservation of classical learning in barbarian kingdoms reflected the continued prestige of Roman educational traditions among peoples who had conquered the empire politically but acknowledged its cultural superiority. Scholars like Boethius and Cassiodorus served barbarian kings while preserving Greek and Latin texts that would otherwise have been lost to posterity. The transformation of Roman cities under barbarian rule revealed both the continuity and the change that characterized this period of transition. Urban centers like Ravenna, Toledo, and Toulouse maintained their architectural grandeur while adapting their functions to serve barbarian courts rather than imperial administration. The forums became markets, the basilicas became churches, and the baths became ruins, but the essential urban framework survived. The religious policies of barbarian kingdoms reflected their understanding that Christianity had become the foundation of European civilization. Even Arian kings like Theodoric acknowledged the authority of Orthodox bishops while maintaining their own theological positions. The gradual conversion of barbarian peoples to orthodoxy demonstrated Christianity's success in providing cultural unity that transcended political fragmentation. The economic transformation of the former Western Empire under barbarian rule revealed both the costs and the benefits of political decentralization. Trade networks contracted as political unity disappeared, but local production flourished as communities became more self-sufficient. The villa system adapted to serve barbarian landlords while maintaining agricultural productivity that supported both Roman and Germanic populations. The persistence of imperial ideology, even after the empire's political collapse, demonstrated the enduring power of Roman political concepts. Barbarian kings continued to seek recognition from the Eastern Emperor, to use Roman titles and ceremonial forms, and to present themselves as defenders of Roman law and Christian orthodoxy. The empire lived on in the imagination even after it had died in reality. As the 6th century dawned over the transformed landscape of Western Europe, the Roman Empire in the West had become a memory preserved in barbarian kingdoms that maintained its legal, cultural, and religious heritage while adapting its institutions to serve new masters. The barbarian tide had not destroyed Roman civilization, but had transformed it into something new, neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but a synthesis that would provide the foundation for medieval European development. The eagles had fallen, but the ideas they had carried continued to soar over lands that remembered Rome even as they obeyed barbarian kings. The empire had ended, but the imperial dream persisted, waiting for new champions who would seek to restore universal order under different banners and in different forms. While the Western Empire crumbled beneath barbarian pressure and internal decay, the eastern provinces underwent a remarkable transformation that would extend Roman imperial tradition for another 1,000 years. Constantinople, the city that Constantine had created as a Christian Rome, became the beating heart of a civilization that preserved Roman political institutions while developing a distinctly Greek cultural identity and an intensely Christian spiritual character. The reign of Justinian West from 527 to 565 CE represented both the culmination of late Roman imperial ambition and the beginning of Byzantine civilization proper. The emperor who claimed the title, Sleepless Guardian, embodied the Eastern Empire's determination to maintain Roman universal pretensions while adapting to the realities of a world in which barbarian kingdoms controlled former imperial territories. Justinian's legal codification represented the Eastern Empire's greatest intellectual achievement and its most enduring contribution to human civilization. The Corpus Juris Civilis that emerged from the emperor's commission systematized a millennium of Roman legal development while providing the foundation for European legal systems that endure to the present day. The Code, the Digest, the Institutes, and the novels created a comprehensive legal framework that demonstrated Roman civilization's capacity for systematic thought and practical administration. The reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals under Belisarius demonstrated that the Eastern Empire retained the military capacity to challenge barbarian kingdoms that had seemed permanently established. The destruction of the Vandal fleet, the restoration of Orthodox Christianity, and the re-establishment of imperial administration in Africa proved that the Roman Empire was not merely a historical memory, but a living force capable of reclaiming unsought patrimony. The Gothic Wars in Italy revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of Justinian's imperial restoration. The initial successes of Belisarius, who captured Naples, Rome, and Ravenna with relatively small forces, suggested that barbarian kingdoms lacked the legitimacy and internal cohesion necessary to resist determined imperial assault. Yet the prolonged resistance of the Ostrogoths under Totila demonstrated that barbarian peoples had developed genuine attachment to their new homes and would fight desperately to defend them. The plague that devastated the Eastern Empire during the 540s created demographic and economic crises that undermined Justinian's imperial ambitions, while revealing the vulnerability of even the most prosperous regions to pandemic disease. The bubonic plague that contemporaries called Justinian's plague reduced the empire's population by perhaps 1/3, creating labor shortages and fiscal problems that made continued expansion impossible. Hagia Sophia, the great church that Justinian constructed in Constantinople, became the architectural symbol of Byzantine civilization and its synthesis of Roman engineering, Greek aesthetics, and Christian spirituality. The building's revolutionary dome, which seemed to float unsupported above the nave, demonstrated that the Eastern Empire had surpassed even classical achievements while serving purposes that the ancient world had never imagined. The religious controversies that consumed imperial attention during this period, particularly the Monophysite disputes that divided Egypt and Syria from Constantinople, revealed the difficulty of maintaining theological unity in an empire that encompassed diverse cultural traditions and religious perspectives. Justinian's attempts to reconcile conflicting interpretations of Christ's nature through imperial edicts demonstrated both the political importance of religious questions and the limitations of secular authority in matters of faith. The Persian wars that dominated the later years of Justinian's reign exhausted imperial resources while failing to achieve decisive results. The conflict with Sassanid Persia revealed that the Eastern Empire faced formidable enemies who possessed administrative capabilities and military technologies that matched or exceeded Byzantine achievements. The Treaty of 562 CE that ended the war acknowledged that neither empire could achieve decisive victory over the other. The transformation of imperial administration during the 6th and 7th centuries reflected the Eastern Empire's adaptation to changing strategic and demographic realities. The theme system that gradually replaced traditional provincial organization created military districts governed by generals who combined civil and military authority while depending upon local militias for defense against Arab raiders. The iconoclastic controversies that erupted in the 8th century revealed the distinctive character that Byzantine Christianity had developed. The imperial attempts to prohibit religious images reflected both theological concerns about idolatry and political efforts to reduce the wealth and influence of monasteries that had become centers of opposition to imperial policy. The ultimate triumph of the icon, supporters demonstrated the power of popular religious sentiment to resist imperial pressure while establishing the theological foundations that would distinguish Orthodox Christianity from both Catholicism and Islam. The Arab conquests that swept through the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century deprived the Eastern Empire of its richest provinces, while forcing a fundamental reorientation of Byzantine strategic priorities. The loss of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine reduced the empire's revenues by 2/3, while eliminating the agricultural surpluses that had supported Constantinople's population and the military forces that defended the remaining territories. Yet the empire's survival in the face of overwhelming Arab pressure demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. The successful defense of Constantinople against repeated Arab sieges, the maintenance of naval superiority in the Aegean Sea, and the preservation of imperial administration in Anatolia and the Balkans proved that Byzantine civilization possessed the institutional strength and popular loyalty necessary for long-term survival. The military innovations that enabled Byzantine resistance to Arab expansion revealed the empire's capacity for tactical and technological adaptation. The development of Greek fire, the revolutionary incendiary weapon that gave Byzantine fleets decisive advantages in naval warfare, demonstrated that the empire could still achieve technological superiority over its enemies through scientific innovation and engineering skill. The cultural transformation of the empire during this period created a distinctive Byzantine identity that combined Roman political traditions with Greek intellectual heritage and Christian spiritual values. The educational system that preserved classical Greek literature while emphasizing Christian theology created a learned elite that could appreciate both Aristotle and the Church Fathers, both Homer and the Gospels. The economic adaptations that enabled the empire's survival revealed both the costs and the benefits of territorial contraction. The loss of Egypt's grain shipments forced Constantinople to develop alternative food sources while encouraging agricultural intensification in the remaining territories. The empire became more compact but also more cohesive, more defensible but also more dependent upon the loyalty of its reduced population. The religious diplomacy that characterized Byzantine foreign policy reflected the empire's understanding that theological influence could compensate for military weakness. The conversion of Slavic peoples to Orthodox Christianity, the establishment of autocephalous churches under Byzantine influence, and the development of a commonwealth of Orthodox nations created spheres of cultural influence that transcended political boundaries. The artistic achievements of the Middle Byzantine period demonstrated the empire's continued creative vitality despite territorial losses and military pressures. The mosaics of Ravenna, the manuscripts of Constantinople, and the architectural innovations of provincial churches revealed a civilization that could still produce works of beauty and sophistication that rivaled the greatest achievements of the classical past. The administrative genius that enabled a much-reduced empire to maintain effective government revealed the enduring vitality of Roman institutional traditions. The theme system, the professional bureaucracy, and the sophisticated tax collection methods that characterized Middle Byzantine administration proved that Roman governmental skills could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining essential continuity with imperial traditions. The intellectual renaissance that occurred during the 9th and 10th centuries demonstrated that territorial contraction could coincide with cultural flowering. The preservation and copying of classical texts, the development of new historical and theological works, and the systematic codification of Canaan law created a body of learning that would eventually influence both the Islamic world and medieval Western Europe. The military recovery that began under the Macedonian dynasty proved that the empire retained the capacity for territorial expansion when strategic circumstances permitted. The reconquest of Crete, Cyprus, and portions of Syria demonstrated that Byzantine arms could still achieve decisive victories when properly led and adequately supplied. The diplomatic achievements of this period revealed the empire's sophisticated understanding of balance of power politics. The complex negotiations with Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and Western Europeans demonstrated that Byzantine diplomacy could achieve through negotiation what military force could not accomplish through conquest. The ecclesiastical diplomacy that culminated in the conversion of Russia to Orthodox Christianity represented perhaps the empire's greatest long-term achievement. The establishment of Orthodox Christianity as the official religion of the emerging Russian state created a cultural and religious bond that would influence European development for centuries, while providing the Byzantine Empire with a powerful ally in its struggles against both Muslim and Catholic enemies. The technological innovations that characterized this period demonstrated the empire's continued capacity for scientific and engineering advancement. The development of new military technologies, agricultural techniques, and manufacturing processes revealed a civilization that remained creative and adaptive despite the challenges it faced. As the first millennium CE drew to its close, the Byzantine Empire had proven that Roman imperial tradition could survive the collapse of the Western Empire while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The empire that emerged from the crucible of Arab conquest was smaller than its predecessors, but also more coherent, more defensible, and more unified in its cultural and religious identity. The Eastern Phoenix had risen from the ashes of classical antiquity with wings that could carry Roman eagles over Orthodox lands from the Black Sea to the Aegean, from the Balkans to Anatolia. Though the empire would face new challenges in the centuries to come, from Seljuk Turks, crusading Catholics, and Ottoman sultans, it had already demonstrated that the Roman genius for adaptation and survival could transcend even the most catastrophic historical transformations. The empire that called itself Roman while speaking Greek, that preserved classical learning while embracing Christian faith, that maintained ancient institutions while adapting to medieval realities, had created a unique synthesis that would influence the development of Eastern Europe, the preservation of classical culture, and the evolution of Christian civilization for another 4 centuries. The fall of Constantinople to Mehmed II's cannons on May 29, 1453, marked the end of an empire that had endured for over 2 millennia, yet the echoes of Roman civilization continued to reverberate through the corridors of European consciousness long after the last emperor had fallen defending the walls of the city that Constantine had built. The Roman legacy proved more durable than Roman armies, more persistent than Roman institutions, more influential than Roman territorial dominion. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged in medieval Western Europe represented the most explicit attempt to restore Roman imperial authority under Christian auspices. Charlemagne's coronation by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800 CE symbolically transferred imperial authority from the Byzantine East to the Frankish West, while claiming continuity with the empire of Augustus and Constantine. Though the Holy Roman Empire bore little resemblance to its ancient predecessor in terms of territorial extent or administrative efficiency, it preserved the Roman concept of universal monarchy and the imperial ideal of uniting diverse peoples under a single sovereign authority. The legal systems that developed throughout medieval and modern Europe drew their fundamental principles from the Corpus Juris Civilis that Justinian's commissioners had compiled in 6th century Constantinople. Roman law's emphasis on written statutes, Systematic jurisprudence and individual rights provided the foundation for legal traditions that would eventually spread throughout the world. The maxims that Roman jurists had formulated, innocent until proven guilty, the burden of proof lies with the accuser, ignorance of the law is no excuse, became the bedrock of Western legal thought. The Catholic Church emerged as perhaps the most successful inheritor of Roman organizational genius, adapting imperial administrative structure, yours to serve spiritual rather than temporal purposes. The papal bureaucracy that developed in medieval Rome consciously modeled itself upon imperial precedents, while the ecclesiastical hierarchy that extended throughout Catholic Europe replicated the chain of command that had once bound Roman provinces to the imperial capital. The Latin language that had once carried imperial edicts throughout the Mediterranean world became the sacred tongue of Catholic liturgy and scholarship. The Renaissance humanists who rediscovered classical antiquity found in Roman literature and philosophy intellectual resources that challenged medieval assumptions while providing alternative models for human achievement. The republican ideals that Cicero had championed, the historical consciousness that Tacitus had developed, and the philosophical synthesis that figures like Seneca had created offered Renaissance thinkers alternatives to the feudal and ecclesiastical authorities that dominated their contemporary world. The American founding fathers drew extensively upon Roman republican theory when designing the constitutional framework for their new nation. The separation of powers that Montesquieu had identified in the Roman constitution, the concept of mixed government that Polybius had analyzed, and the civic virtues that Plutarch had celebrated in his biographical studies provided intellectual foundations for American political institutions. The dome of the Capitol building, the fasces that adorned American official seals, and the Latin mottos that appeared on American currency demonstrated the new republic's conscious identification with Roman precedents. The architectural legacy of Rome continued to influence European and American building throughout the early modern and modern periods. The neoclassical movement that swept through Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries centered a conscious attempt to recreate the grandeur of Roman public architecture while adapting classical proportions to contemporary needs. The Capitol buildings, supreme courts, and legislative chambers that appeared throughout the Western world bore witness to the enduring appeal of Roman architectural symbolism. The concept of citizenship that Rome had developed, the revolutionary idea that political membership could transcend ethnic and geographical boundaries, provided the foundation for modern democratic theory. The Roman innovation of extending citizenship to conquered peoples, the development of legal protections for individual rights, and the creation of representative institutions capable of governing diverse populations established precedents that would influence constitutional development throughout the modern world. The military traditions that Rome had established continued to influence European warfare long after the last legion had disbanded. The emphasis on discipline, training, and systematic logistics that had characterized Roman armies became standard features of modern military organization, while the Roman concepts of strategic planning and tactical flexibility provided models for military theorists from Machiavelli to Clausewitz. The urban planning principles that Roman engineers had developed provided templates for city building that influenced municipal development throughout the Western world. The grid systems that organized Roman colonial cities, the emphasis on public spaces and monumental architecture, and the integration of infrastructure systems like aqueducts and sewers established standards for urban design that continue to influence city planning today. The educational traditions that had flourished in the Roman world provided the foundation for Western academic culture. The trivium and quadrivium that organized medieval education traced their origins to Roman pedagogical practices, while the emphasis on rhetoric, literature, and philosophical inquiry that characterized Rome and higher education established intellectual standards that influenced European and American universities for centuries. The historical consciousness that Roman writers had developed, The understanding that human societies evolve through time and that political institutions must adapt to changing circumstances provided intellectual tools that proved essential for understanding and managing social change. The cyclical theories of history that figures like Polybius had developed, the emphasis on moral and political lessons that historians like Livy had emphasized, and the analytical approach to causation that Tacitus had pioneered, established historiographical traditions that continue to influence historical scholarship. The engineering achievements that Roman civilization had produced continued to inspire technological innovation throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The concrete that Roman builders had perfected, the architectural techniques that had enabled the construction of massive domes and vaults, and the hydraulic engineering that had supplied Roman cities with water provided models for later technological development while demonstrating the possibilities of systematic scientific inquiry. The political vocabulary that modern democracies employ draws extensively upon Latin terminology that Roman political theorists had developed. Words like republic, citizen, constitution, legislature, executive, and judiciary carry Roman connotations that influence how contemporary societies understand political relationships and institutional arrangements. The imperial ideal that Rome had embodied, the vision of a universal state that could unite diverse peoples under rational law and efficient administration, continued to attract political theorists and nation builders long after the empire's collapse. Napoleon's attempts to create a European empire, the British Empire's claims to civilizing mission, and even modern projects like the European Union draw inspiration from Roman precedents while adapting imperial concepts to contemporary circumstances. The cultural synthesis that Roman civilization had achieved, the combination of Greek intellectual sophistication with practical administrative skill, the integration of diverse religious traditions within a coherent political framework, and the creation of a cosmopolitan culture that transcended ethnic boundaries, provided models for subsequent attempts at cultural integration and international cooperation. The Stoic philosophy that had reached its highest development under Roman thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca continued to influence Western ethical thought long after the empire's fall. The emphasis on individual moral responsibility, the understanding of duty as the foundation of social order, and the acceptance of fate as a necessary component of wisdom provided philosophical resources that proved remarkably adaptable to changing historical circumstances. The legal principles that Roman jurists had developed, the concepts of natural law, individual rights, and governmental accountability provided intellectual foundations for constitutional movements throughout the modern world. The idea that political authority must be limited by law, that individuals possess inherent rights that governments cannot violate, and that rulers must answer to their subjects for their actions established precedents that would influence democratic development for centuries. As the modern world grapples with questions of global governance, cultural diversity, and institutional design, the Roman example continues to provide both inspiration and warning. Rome's success in creating inclusive political institutions, its achievements in law and administration, and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances offer positive models for contemporary challenges. Yet Rome's ultimate failure, its transformation from republic to empire to autocracy, and its eventual collapse remind modern observers that even the most successful political systems are vulnerable to corruption, complacency, and the inexorable forces of historical change. In the deepening twilight of history, as shadows lengthen across the ruins of amphitheaters and the broken columns of forgotten forums, the Roman story reveals itself as something far more profound than the mere chronicle of conquest and collapse. It emerges as humanity's most ambitious attempt to impose rational order upon the chaos of existence, to create from the raw material of tribal conflict and ethnic hatred a universal community governed by law rather than force, by justice rather than privilege, by shared aspiration rather than mutual fear. The Roman achievement transcended the boundaries of any single civilization or historical epoch because it addressed the fundamental questions that have haunted human consciousness since people first gathered in communities larger than extended families. How should diverse peoples live together in peace? What is the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective security? How can societies balance the demands of order with the requirements of justice? Can human beings create institutions that serve the common good while respecting individual dignity? Rome's answers to these eternal questions were neither perfect nor permanent, but they were systematic and sophisticated in ways that continue to influence human thought and practice 2 millennia after the last emperor fell defending Constantinople's walls. The Roman concept of citizenship created a new form of human identity that transcended the accidents of birth and geography, establishing the revolutionary principle that political community could be based upon shared commitment to common values rather than ethnic kinship or territorial proximity. The legal system that Roman jurists developed over centuries of practical experience established principles of justice that have shaped Western civilization's understanding of human rights and governmental responsibility. The idea that law should be written rather than customary, rational rather than arbitrary, universal rather than particular, represented an intellectual breakthrough that transformed the possibilities of human cooperation on a large scale. The administrative genius that enabled Rome to govern territories stretching from Scotland to Sudan demonstrated that effective government could operate across vast distances and among radically different peoples without requiring cultural uniformity or religious conformity. The Roman provincial system showed that imperial authority could be both powerful and flexible, both unified and diverse, both efficient and respectful of local traditions. Yet the Roman story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that threaten all human institutions, no matter how well designed or successful they may initially appear. The transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire revealed how easily democratic institutions can be subverted by ambitious individuals who manipulate popular fears and legislative procedures to concentrate power in their own hands. The corruption of Roman virtue by imperial wealth and luxury demonstrated how prosperity can undermine the moral foundations upon which political freedom depends. The religious transformations that accompanied Rome's evolution from pagan republic to Christian empire illustrated both the possibilities and the perils of attempting to ground political authority in spiritual conviction. Constantine's conversion brought moral purpose to imperial government, while creating new sources of conflict between religious and secular authority. The subsequent history of church-state relations in Europe would be shaped by tensions that first emerged in the 4th century empire. The barbarian invasions that ultimately overwhelmed the Western Empire revealed the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated civilizations to demographic pressure and military assault from peoples who possessed less cultural refinement but greater military mobility and demographic vitality. Rome's fate demonstrated that technological and organizational superiority could not indefinitely compensate for numerical disadvantage and strategic overextension. The economic factors that contributed to imperial decline, currency debasement, taxation burdens, trade disruption, and agricultural decay, illustrated how political stability depends upon sound fiscal policies and sustainable economic practices. Rome's financial difficulties revealed the dangers of maintaining military commitments that exceed economic resources and of pursuing policies that discourage productive investment while encouraging speculative consumption. The social changes that weakened imperial unity, the growth of regional loyalties, the decline of civic virtue, and the increasing gap between rich and poor demonstrated how cultural cohesion can erode even when political institutions remain formally intact. Rome's experience showed that empires can collapse from internal decay as readily as from external assault. Yet the ultimate lesson of Roman history transcends the specific circumstances of any particular civilization or historical period. Rome's story reveals both the heights that human communities can achieve when guided by rational principles and competent leadership, and the depths to which they can sink when corruption, incompetence, and moral decay undermine the foundations of social order. The Roman legacy endures not because Rome avoided the fate that befalls all human institutions, but because Rome achieved something genuinely universal in its vision of human possibility. The Roman conception of natural law, individual rights, and governmental accountability provided intellectual resources that have proven remarkably adaptable to changing historical circumstances and diverse cultural contexts. The Roman example of cultural synthesis, the ability to absorb the best elements of diverse traditions while maintaining essential unity, offers hope that human societies can create inclusive communities without sacrificing the particular excellences that different peoples have developed. Rome showed that universalism need not mean uniformity, that unity need not require conformity, that order need not eliminate diversity. The Roman understanding of historical change, the recognition that all human institutions are temporary and that political wisdom requires constant adaptation to evolving circumstances, provides guidance for contemporary leaders who must navigate between the demands of continuity and the requirements of reform. Rome's success and failure both demonstrate that political survival requires the ability to change without losing essential identity. As we survey the landscape of the modern world, with its global communications, international institutions, and universal aspirations, we can recognize elements of the Roman dream in contemporary attempts to create inclusive political communities that respect both individual rights and collective responsibilities. European Union, the United Nations, and other international organizations represent modern efforts to achieve on a global scale what Rome accomplished within the Mediterranean world. Yet the Roman example also reminds us that the greatest human achievements are fragile, and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against both external threats and internal corruption. The Roman eagles may have fallen, but the Roman vision of universal order under law continues to inspire those who believe that human beings can transcend the limitations of tribe and nation to create communities worthy of their highest aspirations. In the end, the Roman story becomes our story, the eternal human struggle to build something permanent from materials that are inherently temporary, to create justice from institutions wielded by fallible human beings, to establish peace among peoples whose interests and cultures inevitably conflict. Rome's greatness lay not in avoiding these contradictions, but in achieving a temporary resolution of them that was both magnificent in its scope and instructive in its ultimate limitations. The 7 hills where it all began now slumber again beneath Mediterranean stars, their ancient stones bearing witness to dreams of empire that rose like the dawn and faded like the evening mist. Yet in that stone and in the human memory that preserves the meaning of those dreams lies the eternal Roman message that the greatest human aspiration is not to live forever, but to build something worthy of being remembered, something that enlarges the possibilities of human community and enriches the heritage of human achievement. The empire has passed, but the dream endures, the dream of a world united not by conquest but by consent, governed not by force but by law, inspired not by fear but by hope in the nobility of human possibilities when guided by wisdom, sustained by virtue, and devoted to the common good that transcends all particular interests and temporary advantages.